Hello, my name is Dr. George Sparks. I am the archaeologist for Bible Interact, and we're going to continue with our study of the bad girls of the Bible. And the next young lady that we're going to talk about is Athaliah. Now, before we go into the actual lecture, I got a few artifacts I'd like to share from the collection. First of all, what would we find in a bad girl's house? Well, possibly a decanter. And this is a Iron Age 2. So we could date this to around maybe 8th, 7th century BC. And let's take a look at it in some of the archaeological terms. First of all, it's made out of terracotta, clay that's been fired in an oven. And this is once again called a decanter. It can have oil, it can have wine, it can have beer, a number of different things that you would find in the house of really about anybody in the Iron Age period. Next, let's take a look at a jar handle. Let's say that you have your decanter, but you want to make sure that decanter is known to be yours. Well, you would have your handle stamped. Okay, you can see a little stamp seal on this handle. The stamp seal, where do they come from? Well, usually it's a seal that would be worn around the neck or on the finger as a ring. Now, it would be carved in the reverse, the mirror image. So when they stamp the clay, you could actually read it. In the Iron Age period, where we find in the scriptural narrative, the event of King Hezekiah and how he had to construct a broad wall, very wide wall, which was excavated some years ago, and you can go see it today, all right? And they had to tear down houses during that period and use that material to build the broad wall because King Hezekiah was preparing the city for the siege of the Assyrians. Another thing that he did is that he constructed, not he himself, but his team constructed a water tunnel from outside the city gates or very near the city gate into the city where the water system itself could be protected during a siege. There was an inscription, it's called Hezekiah's inscription, and it actually has a rendering of what exactly happened at that period where there were two construction groups, one at one end and the other at the other, and they started actually digging towards each other. So where they both met, there's a dedicated inscription, which was cut away in antiquity, I believe around 1850, and now is in the Museum of Turkey at Istanbul. Why did I say that? Because during the time period of Hezekiah, all this cost a lot of money, building the broad wall, constructing the city water tunnel. One of the theories is that he collected revenue in large storage jars like this right here. It'd be very, very large. You can see this would be a very big jar. And they would collect possibly taxes from the people, maybe in the form of jewelry because they didn't have coins back then. And they would be stored inside a large vessel. Now that's one interpretation, and there are others to make sure citizens knew these taxes were going to the king. They had a little seal on their handles too, and they are called Lamech handles, Lamech meaning the king. Throughout the excavations of Israel, when we get to the time period of King Hezekiah and the siege, the cities that were participating in this event, all right, we find evidence of these vessels because of the storage handles are nice and thick, and these seem to remain. And we have the little stamp seal called Lamech, belonging to the king, with the seal or the image that possibly belonged to King Hezekiah. Also, since we're talking about a siege, one of the most common weapons was a stone. This is cut away out of limestone, and there would be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these that would be used during a siege. And they could be put into, we'll just call it a catapult, and thrown at the enemy. And we find hundreds of these. And let's get to the story, the epic event of Athaliah. Who is this young lady and where did she come from? Well, let's give some dates. It's going to be the Iron Age 2 period, and we're going to be in the 9th century BC, almost 100 years after Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem. She was born in 896 BC, and she died 836 BC in Jerusalem. Her husband was King Jehoram, king of Judah, who died of an illness according to the narrative in the Bible, because he was a very evil king, and God struck him with a sickness which he did not recover from. When he died, Jehoram passed away. His son took over, which was the son of Jehoram and Athaliah. And this was King Ahaziah of Judah. Now, throughout this quick little study here of this bad girl of the Bible, a lot of names are similar. To get the bigger picture of this event, we got to flip between 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. As we do that, the names of the same individuals are a tad different in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. And if you're familiar with these two books in the Bible, then you understand what I mean. But also, we have different individuals being mentioned in Israel who have the same names of individuals that are mentioned in Judah. So let's say I say Ahaziah of Judah. Why do I say that? Because there's a Ahaziah of Israel up north. Remember, at this time, the kingdom is divided, Israel in the north, and of course, Judah in the south. Just a word of warning, so hopefully you don't get confused. Who was Athaliah's siblings? Well, she had what we know as two brothers. One was Jehoram, and Jehoram of what? Jehoram of Israel, and also Ahaziah of Israel. See, I warned you, names are similar. Her grandfather would have been Omri, and we think of the lineage, the dynasty of Ahab and Jezebel. It's the dynasty of Omri, or in the biblical text, it's the house of Omri. If we talk about the genealogy of David, it's the house of David. So in the genealogy house of Omri, Ahab died in a battle with the Arameans. So Athaliah's, I'm going to go through some names. Who was Ahab? Ahab was king of Israel. He died fighting the Arameans. And also we have Ahaziah of Judah. This was the son of Athaliah, because Ahaz of Judah, not Ahaziah, not Ahaziah of Israel. All right. Now, he was killed by Jehu. And Jehu was the son of Jehoshaphat, also a king of Judah. And the scripture has a variant of where Ahaziah, the king of Judah, died. It was either in Megiddo or Samaria. It's not clear exactly where. He might have got injured in Samaria and then passed away in Megiddo. Then Athaliah also had brothers and sons. So we have Jehoram of Israel, and he was also killed by Jehu, and his body was thrown in Naboth's vineyard. Now, who was Naboth? Remember, Ahab and Jezebel had Naboth killed because they wanted his garden, but Naboth did not want to give him Ahab the garden, simply because it's part of his inheritance since the time of Joshua. All right. Now, that's very important for those people when we think about Israel inheriting the land. What does it mean to inherit the land? It means that you have a plot of land that was given to you as an Israelite. You are going to do your best not to lose that, not to lose it, especially you think in that day they were not supposed to have a king. But with king comes taxes. And if you can't pay a tax, what happens? You can lose your house, and your house can be sold, just like today. And if he loses his property, I'm talking about Naboth, if he was to lose his property, he would lose his land. And that would be the inheritance. It'd become quite messy if this happens to quite a few Israelites, that they lose their land to the king. Because next, what's on the agenda? Well, if you don't have land to rent out, or land for your cattle and your crop, because it's no longer yours, you have to work it. You become a slave in your own land. No different than in Egypt. And that was to be avoided. All right. So that was what's so important about Naboth's vineyard. But what comes around goes around. So Jehoram of Israel was killed by Jehu, and his body was thrown in Naboth's vineyard. Do we have any evidence for the house of Omri? And we do. It's called the Moabite stone. It dates to around 1840. So once again, the 9th century BC. And in the translation of the Moabite stone, it actually uses the terminology in translation, the house of Omri. So we have a witness of the house of Omri outside of the Bible. And that's also true for the house of David. Around 1990, there was a team of archaeologists excavating up in Tel Dan, that's in northern Israel, and they found a stone which we call the Tel Dan stone. And then on its translation, we have a statement called Beit David, House of David. So here we have also a representation of the dynasty, the House of David, also of the 9th century, which was excavated in the northern part of Israel. So both witnesses of the house of Omri and the house of David, actually outside the Bible. Who was Athaliah? What's the meaning of her name? Athaliah means exalted of Yahweh, or Yahweh is exalted. And I thought that's kind of interesting because I thought Ahab and Jezebel were busy worshiping Baal. Why would you name your daughter after Yahweh? And I remember the verse in the scriptural narrative where Elijah talks to the people and he says, today, who will you serve? If Baal is God, serve him. If Yahweh is God, serve him. And the people answered him not a word. And I think that's kind of interesting as a way of saying, like, they really don't know. Maybe they're both gods. But it seems like in the household of Ahab and Jezebel, they've also are still continuing using the name of Yahweh. Did they do this because they knew for political reasons she was going to marry the king of Judah? And in Judah, they still worshiped Yahweh, and that's where the temple was. And if they could name their daughter Yahweh is exalted, and then she marries the king of Judah, well, that caused less problems. But at the same time, they could sneak in Baal worship. Let's get into the verses here. When Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw her son's death, she proceeded to destroy the whole family of David, the dynasty of David. She was, of course, granddaughter of Omri and the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. But upon the death of her son, Ahaziah, she was very zealous to rule after his death and dedicate the worship of Baal official in the land of Judah. She ruled for a total of 6 years. This left only after her son. Now, when I say it was her and King Jehoram's son. Now, a king will have many wives and many sons and many daughters. So when we look at these individuals within this epic event, within this story, they're not all sons and daughters of Ahab, they're not all sons and daughters of Jehoram and Athaliah. So this left only the grandchildren of Athaliah to be put to death. All right, now these are the grandchildren of really not Athaliah, but her husband, who was the king, which was Jehoram. These are Jehoram's family. Now, remember earlier on, it was Jehu that basically exterminated Athaliah's family in the north. Ahab is dead, that's her father. Jezebel is dead, that's her mother. And Jehu also killed hundreds of her family members, basically exterminating the family of Athaliah. Now she has the opportunity to repay that, or maybe she just saw it as a threat that she's surrounded by the king's family, which are, blood relatives, and she is not really a blood relative because they only had one son and he died in battle. What was her strategy? Earlier on, even though Athaliah almost brings the line of David to extinction, we still had that prophecy in 2 Samuel 7 and 16 that said that the house of David would rule over Israel and Judah forever. It doesn't seem like that's going to happen, does it? At least at this point. Athaliah, her purge, brought the house of David almost to that brink of extinction, just like the dinosaurs almost, right? Athaliah duplicated the wicked deeds of her father and her mother, but also the deeds of her husband. I think sometimes the Bible portrays the kings up north of Israel as all bad. Now, we have a few good kings of Judah, so we have no kings of Israel then being good. and only a few kings of Judah being good. But this is what happens. There's a young lady whose name is Jehosheba, and Jehosheba is a daughter of King Jehoram, but she's not a daughter of Athaliah. And Athaliah has to be suspicious of these family members that are out there. Are they going to try to get rid of her? The story continues. Jehosheba, which is the daughter of the king Jehoram and sister of Ahaziah. Now, Ahaziah, remember, died in battle, and that was Athaliah's husband. It does get confusing. He had a half sister, Jehosheba, all right? And she took the last remaining child, male heir, Jehoash, the son of Ahaziah, and she stole him away, and she took with him his nanny. And he was the sole survivor, and he was kept from being murdered by Athaliah. She put him and his nurse in a bedroom to hide from Athaliah, so he was not killed. He remained hidden with the nurse at the temple of the Lord for 6 years while Athaliah ruled the land. Now, this is kind of interesting. So he's hid at first in probably the palace, a room in the palace, and given opportunity, they were moved from the palace to the temple. Now, there's a reason for this. Jehosheba was Ahaziah's, here we go, half sister. And since Jehoash, that's the boy that she saved, or Joash, depends First Kings or Second Chronicles, how you read it, had been born to Jehoram through a mother other than Athaliah. See, Second Chronicles 24:1. And perhaps this was the case also for Jehosheba, since she was probably also, her mother was not Athaliah, but the king was her father. How do we know? Well, we looked this up. We look up Second Chronicles 24:1. It says the mother Zabiah, and she was from Beersheba. This is kind of interesting. We got a lot of Shebas going on here. We got Jehosheba, which means Yahweh of the oath. And she is from Beersheba, which means the well of the oath. Earlier on, it was Bathsheba, and that was David's squeeze that he saw from his house, and she was bathing. And then we have the Queen of Sheba. And this Sheba was, you could say, interested in King Solomon in his wisdom. And then she goes back home. And there's a legend that later on, the Ark of the Covenant possibly follows her. Now, lots of Shebas in the Bible, but we're looking at Jehosheba. And her mother is Zabiah, is from Beersheba. Long way from Jerusalem, but somehow the king is able to find lots of wives. It appears that she secretly entered where Jehoash, that's the boy, was, and also his nurse. And she sneaks him out and hides him. And he was the only king's son that was saved alive. So we're being a little repetitive here. And this was a very brave move. I thought this was interesting for her to do, because remember, there's no reason for the queen to save her because she's not really a blood relative. And all of Athaliah's relatives have already have been slaughtered by Jehu. How easy would that have been to end up dead by trying to save the king, right? Or that little boy who was to be the king. It appears that she hid him in a storage room. It's got to be a room where we can absorb sound. Makes sense? What absorbs sound? So I looked up some study, and I thought it very interesting that she possibly, according to some scholars, hid him in a side room where the mattresses and the bedding were kept, linen, if you will, and cloth does seem to absorb sound, wouldn't it? That's kind of interesting. So I believe that's pretty good. Now, they didn't make that connection when I studied what this extra room was, but when it was like a place where they keep mattresses and bedding, I thought, well, that's pretty interesting if a kid's going to cry, but it's not exactly safe, is it? So then very shortly, when the coast is clear, she moves Jehosheba to the temple. It's interesting that she moves the king to the temple. What's so safe about the temple? Well, the priest of Judah that minister to the Lord in the temple. I kind of look like a Catholic priest right here, don't I? They're not Catholic. What does that mean? They can have wives. Jehoshaphat actually was married to the high priest, Jehoiada. Now, that all makes sense. She takes the boy, she hides him in a bedchamber full of linen so they can't hear him crying. Then she moves the boy to the temple because why? He's going to be saved there because her husband is the high priest. Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? In the 7th year of Jehoiada, the high priest, who was married to Jehoshaphat, sent for the commanders of the units. Now, this is 7 years gone by, 7th year. Sent for the commanders of the hundreds, the Kerites, and also the guards, and they brought him to the temple of the Lord, and they made a covenant with them and put them under oath at the temple. So what's going on here? The high priest, Jehoiada, has called the captain of the guards. The guards are called the Kerites. He's called them to the temple because he's in charge of the temple, and he probably knows all the priests and all the guards that are around the temple because he's the high priest, and it's safe, and they might have more camaraderie with the high priest than they do with the guards of the palace that are watching Athaliah. They might be more dedicated to her. So Jehoiada is bringing these Kerites closer to him, and he's making a covenant with them, and he put them under an oath at the temple of the Lord. And then he showed them the king's son. I had to look up who were these Kerites now. The bedchambers, the linen, the temple, the high priest. It makes sense. But who are the Kerites? What makes them so safe? The Kerites are associated with another group of people called the Pelethites. Who are the Pelethites? The Pelethites are also mentioned once, maybe twice, in 2 Samuel 20, verse 23. These people are mercenaries, soldiers and bodyguards. What's a mercenary? They're loyal to whoever pays them. So maybe they're paid through the temple treasury. The high priest, Jehoiada, probably could control pretty much some of these funds, and they're going to be dedicated to whoever is paying them. And we read this in 1 Kings 14:27. Jehoiada receives an agreement of support from the royal guards, sealed with an oath of alliance, and then presents Joash to them. That's the boy. The military leader supported the plan to dispose of Athaliah and also to make Joash or Jehoash king. Jehoiada's plan to unseat the idolatrous Athaliah was carefully orchestrated. He's choosing out the time, the place, which guards are going to be loyal to him. Got it. This is going to be a coup. He's going to betray the queen. And if it doesn't go right, a lot of people are going to die. It's probably going to be the end of the dynasty of David. That's it. The commanders of the units of 100 did just as Jehoiada the priest ordered. Each one took his men, those that were going on duty on the Sabbath and those that were going off duty. They came to Jehoiada the priest, and he gave the commanders the spears and the shields that belonged to King David and that were in the temple of the Lord. What are you doing with spears and weapons in the house of God? And in 2 Samuel 8 and 7, David actually defeated an enemy. I'm not going to go into great detail. And as part of the bootay, he took their shields and their weapons. And because this becomes a trophy that God was with them in this victory, he presents it to the temple. So this was, in a way, was kind of like a temple offering. I'm going to do a little backtrack here. I was taught in seminary that the Egyptians basically lied to us because they never record a loss. They only record victories. They never lose a battle. We never read of a loss. Well, if they never lost a battle, they would still be here. Does that make sense? But what they did was the buildings that remain standing in Egypt, the ancient buildings, are usually the temples built of stone, not the palaces that were made of mud brick, the temples where they went to worship their gods. And on the walls of their temples, they would dedicate their victories. So in other words, we'd read only about their victories on the walls of the temples because they were being dedicated in honor of their deities. You don't record the losses on the temples. That would be shameful. So in a way, I think we misunderstood what the Egyptians were doing. They were not lying to us by not recording their losses. We know they had losses. They knew they had losses, but they didn't carve their losses on the temples. Why was the shields and the weapons at the temple of the Lord? Because they were trophies of David's victory. And they're going to be used because Jehoiada is going to give those weapons to the guards of the Karaites. But it makes sense, doesn't it? A little bit of hard studying and the whole thing seems to piece together like a nice puzzle. The guards, each with a weapon now in hand, stationed themselves around the king, the little boy, near the altar and the temple, to the south and to the north and to all sides of the temple. They're getting ready for the coup. Jehoiada brought out the king's son and put a crown on his head. He presented him with a copy of the covenant and proclaimed him king. They anointed him. The word anointed means Messiah, because Messiah means anointed. They anointed him, and the people clapped their hands and shouted, "Long live the king." You got a crown on your head, and they're out there yelling, "Long live the king." Guess who's going to show up? When Athaliah heard this noise that were made by the guards and by the people, she went first to the people and to the temple of the Lord. She looked, and there was the king, that little boy, standing by the pillar, as the custom was. The officers and also the trumpeters were beside the king, and all the people of the land were rejoicing and blowing trumpets. And Athaliah tore her robe and called out and cried out, "Treason, treason." And indeed it was. Jehoiada, the priest, ordered the commanders of the units of the 100 who were in charge of the troops, bring her out between the ranks and put a sword to anyone that follows her. So anybody that's loyal to her or suspicion of being loyal should be put to death. For the priest had said she must not be put to death at the temple of the Lord. So they seized her, and as she reached the place where the horses entered the palace grounds, there she was put to death. Jehoiada then made a covenant between the Lord, the king, and the people, that they would be the Lord's people. He also made a covenant between the king and the people. And all the people of the land went to the temple of Baal, and they tore it down, and they smashed the altars, and they smashed the idols to pieces. And they also killed Mattan, the priest of Baal, in front of the altar. This kind of reminds me of the excavation of Hatzor, where when in the excavation they found artifacts or the remnants of idols, and the heads were smashed and the arms were smashed. And in the ancient world, that's one way to make sure that that deity does not come back to life in any form, is that you separate the heads from the hands. Right? We see the same thing when the Ark of the Covenant is in the city of the Philistines, and Dagon falls. And he falls the first time, and then he falls the second time. The second time, he's in pieces. Till next time, like and subscribe. Bible Interact. I appreciate your time. Have a good day.